Great. It looks like people are joining us this evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So this Cooperation Live is going to be an in-conversation discussion between myself, Daniel Monaghan, the Policy Officer at the Co-operative Party, and Ra Cristello, the Deputy Director of Research at the SEIU, United Health Workers Union in the United States, who have played a really important role in delivering California's Employee Ownership Act, which aims to spread employee ownership across the state and really boost the amount of employee-owned firms throughout California, be it employee share ownership plan type of organizations or worker co-ops or other forms of employee ownership as well. Just before we begin and I start the conversation with Ray, I'm just going to discuss a few tips about how we can make this more interactive for everyone going forward. Firstly, for those who are hard of hearing, we are working with live captioning for this event. And if you want to view these captions, you need to enable them yourself by pressing the CC icon on the bottom tools panel of your phone, computer, or tablet. The Zoom call is being recorded as well. And so members who can access, who are not able to join us this evening, can access it after it goes up on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want yourself to be seen on camera, please just turn off your camera and go to audio only. In order to prevent disruptions, only those who are speaking will have their sound enabled. After we've had the brief initial discussion between myself and Ray, we'll open up to a Q&A with members. And there are two ways you can ask a question. The first is by posting any question or comment in the chat box, which is being moderated, and we'll come to that. And the other way is by raising your virtual hand. And when it's your turn to speak, we'll ask you to unmute and you'll be able to ask your question directly. And finally, please bear in mind the cooperative values and principles whilst contributing. So just to start, I guess the best thing would be to ask yourself, Ray, just to introduce yourself and the work you do with the SEIU, and then we'll start discussing the new Employee Ownership Act. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for inviting me. It's really nice to be in conversation with you. I really value learning from one another and our different initiatives. So thank you so much. As Dan said, I'm the Deputy Director of Research at SEIU United Healthcare Workers West. My name is Ray, and we are a very large healthcare workers union in California, so a statewide local. We have about 110,000 workers in our union. Service Employees International Union is, of course, a very large multi-million person union, and we're the healthcare local on the West Coast. And we represent workers who are basically allied healthcare, meaning healthcare workers in hospitals and clinics, not nurses, not doctors, almost everybody else, so professional and technical workers, janitors, food service workers in hospitals, vocational nurses, medical assistants, people like that. And that's who we represent.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. Just coming on to the California Employee Ownership Act, can you tell us a little bit about the recent act and what it hopes to achieve now it's been passed by the governor of California?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you the group that made it happen, because I think it's sort of unique and it's part of the advantage of working in coalition. And second, what it actually does. So there's a coalition called the Work Coalition. The acronym is Worker Owned Recovery California. And at least for me, as somebody who has been a staff person at a labor union for over 15 years, it's somewhat unusual to get work done with non-union partners in a big way. Coalition work can be kind of slower and complicated, but on the other hand, has obvious strengths in terms of bringing, people with different backgrounds and organizations with, different leverage points to the table. So Worker-Owned Recovery California is a group of largely co-op developers, other types of co-op experts, workers from cooperatives who work in various industries, and organized labor. Although I will say, I was the only representative of organized labor. I think it would be wonderful if there were more unions, especially from other industries. Like, we represent healthcare. It would be great to have unions from, food service and all sorts of other. So that's something kind of looking ahead that we hope to strengthen. But this coalition came together during the pandemic, and we were all from somewhat similar angles, looking at ways to be advocates for workers in our constituencies. So for me, from healthcare workers who are unionized, and then for other people in the room, they work on, let's say, cooperative conversions of small businesses. So some of them focus on how to keep sustainable local economies strong, even during huge economic downturns like the pandemic caused here and everywhere pretty much. Some folks are focused on, the gig economy and not letting casualized sort of bottom feeder labor pools take over, things like that. So we came together to set priorities we wanted to work on together. And what we kind of decided over the process of the initial set of months was we really wanted to try to get legislation passed that would incentivize and really scale the way that worker cooperatives take up a space in our economy in California. And there, we were clearly not the first people to think of this. We had plenty of great examples in other countries, some smaller examples in the United States of sort of networked co-ops, and there are some examples of cities being incubators for cooperatives, but nothing at any sort of scale. So that was really our task. So I'll wait to see where folks are interested in, but I'll just skip over to what the act that we did get passed does. So it's called Senate Bill, or SB 1407, the California Employee Ownership Act. The act makes California the second state to do this. So we looked to Colorado, a state that had already done this, which is to create a dedicated office of employee ownership, or what we call a hub, an employee ownership hub, inside of the state Office of Business and Economic Development, which in California, that office is called GoBiz. And to the extent that the GoBiz office is kind of an embedded part of the state apparatus that advises outgoing business owners and people interested in succession planning and things like that, a venue for saying, if this is a viable business, why don't you consider selling it to your workers? So it's largely kind of conversion focused, but there's also some startup technical assistance, advising, and education around worker cooperatives as a model for people to consider, because we collectively decided that education was a huge barrier to people pursuing this path. And those in the room who do this for a living, who do cooperative conversions, will have been telling us and have great data around just that, this, especially with what they're calling the silver tsunami, the kind of impending mass retirement of small business owners, like this now is the time to get more technical assistance, feasibility studies, and just education out there about worker ownership. And like all legislation, we got some of what we want. We didn't get some of what we want. And yeah, I can go into that if folks are interested in, but we did get at least the hub created in legislation through SB 1407.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic. I think there's a lot of really positive things which come out of that, and some big questions. And I guess one is, do you think there's an opportunity to grow the partnership between the labour unions and cooperatives, really, on furthering this agenda, but also, I suppose, other progressive agendas in California and throughout the United States?
Yeah, I certainly do. I feel like we're at the beginning of what, this is going to sound very hopeful, but what could be a significant wave of collaboration between organized labor and the cooperative movement, and scaling both, with the help of this legislation, but also in other ways. So this legislation in particular thankfully, because my union was in the room, and also the statewide labor federation, the very powerful labor federation in California, they weighed in as well, because we wanted them to come out in support of this bill, because that was, that would be a very helpful kind of optic move. So we brought in the Labor Fed, and they had some really helpful guidance around how to sort of inflect organized labor, or the ability of whatever this legislation would create, into organizable labor pools. And so we were able to get that in. So we talked about things like the right of first refusal, for example, where folks probably know what that is here, but giving workers the opportunity, if a business is closing, converting, merging, whatever, the workers getting sort of the first shot at taking it over, which has become actually increasingly an interesting option, given in California, some recent bankruptcy activity. Not that workers would want to buy out anything insolvent, but bankruptcies can be used also in a sort of, fishy way. So anyway, there's places where workers have sort of a runway into taking over a very viable business. And so we tried to give them an advantage in doing that. So there are so certainly the legislation has some part in that. And then the one of the pieces we didn't get in, which has to do more around funding, getting kind of state administered grants and for technical assistance, and financial feasibility studies. Those pieces that we hope to get in the next legislative cycle, those pieces do also have deep organized labor pieces to them. Like, organized labor can be a partner in getting a grant to do a feasibility study. So if you have a unionized, well, in my case, hospital, but if you have a unionized employer of any sort, then the union continues to be a major partner in the cooperative conversion, if that should happen. But outside of this legislation, there is a lot more just organic kind of collaboration happening there are worker-owned co-ops that are becoming unionized that were not. There are more unions like mine that have helped actually start up and incubate co-ops in steel, in healthcare, childcare, home care. All sorts of sectors, although an overabundance in care sectors, which is, I think, not unique to California or the United States, but definitely, I think, so much room to grow together.
Yeah, I think that sounds really positive, and I guess it's almost a growing movement within the labor, the unions, to support worker ownership, really. And as you say, I think it's about raising awareness that this is a viable alternative, and a really good approach for workers as well going forward. I suppose one question which is begging to be asked is, what wasn't in that act which you were hoping to achieve, and what would be the kind of next steps really in achieving that?
Yeah, so at least here, it's common to do sort of the part of the bill that has no financial impact, that's language, and sort of like changing or adding statutory language, and then separately through a trailer bill doing the budget piece of it. And this was a strategic decision, which was that because this was a economically unusual year for California, having a huge deficit, that's usually the opposite in California, at least for like the last decade pre-pandemic. Our coalition hired a lobbyist who's very helpful and insightful, and she gave us lots of insight leading up to this about what we were likely to get and not get. And once we got closer to filing, she gave us pretty strong advice that anything with a price tag over a certain amount was probably just going to get squashed by the governor, for just sort of across the board. So in the interest of at least passing something as a first step, which is not uncommon to pass a piece, and then come back the next cycle and the next and chip away at getting everything you want. We decided to segregate the language, the non-economic language from the trailer bill. So what we did pass was the everything non-economic, and the trailer bill piece got squashed. So what we didn't get was the pieces of the legislation that require money. We didn't get, and we're going to go back for that. And in truth, the amount, the dollar amount on it is not that big, and in most regular legislative cycles would not cause that much, that much scrutiny, really. Like the general ballpark was $20 million. Obviously, that's a lot of money, but given the scale of the GoBiz office and stuff, that's not actually that much. So what that money, not getting that money right now means is that we created the hub. The GoBiz office now has to kind of do the admin infrastructure of creating what will become an actual human being to do this work inside of the GoBiz office. So, and it sets up other structural kind of relationships in the department to that role, but we can't hire somebody into the role. So, and then the second piece is of what that money goes to, it will be grants for businesses wanting to become employee owned. And so that piece also cannot happen yet. So there's other places people can go for those sorts of grants, but the state embedded piece that we wanted for that kind of technical assistance and grant making can't happen until we get that money.
I see, yes. And beyond grants as well, what do you think that money could be used to deliver in terms of growing the employee-owned sector? Would it be things like more business support, startup incubation? And then also, I guess the question is, what if the funding is there, what do you think could be really delivered? Do you think it could be a doubling or a trebling of the size of the employee-owned sector? Interesting to hear where you see the kind of trajectory really of this.
Yeah, well, to work backwards on how we landed where we did about what will this money do, our coalition did sort of like learning sessions and lots of conversations with various stakeholders, and those conversations led us to deciding how would money we ask for be the most impactful. And what we heard was, the $50,000 to $100,000 that it takes a small business to get the right legal and tax advising and initial set of advising that they need is prohibitive. And the folks we talked to who were able to do it at great personal expense, or were sort of just able to do it or squeaked by. But really that initial hurdle, we got such strong feedback that would be a game changer. So that's why that was a big piece. And another is just education that people shouldn't have to pay for, not that people should have to pay for any of this, but the education that's less specialized, that's not held by legal or tax professionals, but is more about the co-op structure, about governance, bylaws, things where there are actually great resources and templates out there, but in different ways they're inaccessible, whether it's language or the way that they're delivered. So making those accessible to people and having just, I guess, in a broad stroke, what we just call technical assistance or education. But the other thing about the human being that isn't able to get hired yet, whoever that should end up being, that person will also work with state agencies to enhance opportunities and reduce barriers to employee ownership, kind of generally. And that person also will be a sort of the state representative partner with other stakeholders to educate business owners and employees about the benefits of employee ownership, provide referrals to the kinds of resources that seem elusive if you're just kind of going at it blind. So the technical employee ownership resources, the legal, financial, capital advising, things like that. There's other language in the bill about, so the person also will report to the legislature so that it also creates, kind of a set of data that advocates can use to rely on to say, oh, we're doing a great job at this, but, like we're still lacking in, BIPOC-led enterprises, or like just really keeping track of what is and isn't happening. So there's like a feedback piece in it that will happen once this is really moving. And then the last is that once the hub is actually populated with a person, that person and others in the GoBiz office will develop recommendations on how state-run capital programs can be used to support employee ownership. So more of a internal infrastructure around financing and capital that's not extractive, that's available to worker-owned entities.
Yes, that absolutely fascinating from our side of things in terms of how you achieve that and how you're looking to do that. Just another question, I think, just on this is the silver tsunami you talk about in terms of all the people of approaching retirement age or just getting there now who want to exit their business and they don't have an obvious successor. And one of the key goals would be to potentially sell up to their workers. How is California and the Work Coalition and yourselves aiming to achieve or really beyond what you're doing already? How do you think we can make sure we really make the most of that golden opportunity in terms of the silver tsunami?
Yeah, here there's an interesting organized labor piece. Since, in California, this isn't true of all states in the US, of course, but in California, we do have, pretty strong organized labor presence. And so unions are kind of the first guard of collectivizing worker voice. So when there is a sale or, a looming bankruptcy or anything like that, where unions normally, like ours for sure, get involved early on, in protecting the pensions and interests of workers that otherwise could be at risk with any sort of, corporate change. Well, adding to that repertoire inside of unions, people who understand the cooperative model, I think is very key, since we are already often involved in these ownership changes. It's just that we're involved in like trying to help workers hold on for dear life to what they have and take, instead of doing that, plus also trying to take a proactive approach of, well, what would actually, is this a place where employee ownership makes sense? Is there a way that we can partner to help that? Also because, unions, at least some, do have their own, substantial resources. So they have legal advising, they have, I have 20 researchers on my team. That's significant. So financial analysts, data analysts, we have, it's, sort of like a little mini think tank. So if it's kind of positioned, this is obviously my hope and my opinion, but that if it's positioned right, that the union can actually be an engine for helping these things happen. And we also are often, the workers themselves and their union are often sort of like the first, outside of a selling owner or a retiring owner, are the first people to realize this is happening and say, oh my gosh, what does this mean for my life and my, the economics of my everyday? So there's sort of an opportunity there. That's like coming from inside the union. So that's what I think.
Absolutely. I think we'll have one more question for myself, and then we'll open up to the floor to members if they have questions for Ray. One which I'm really interested in is there, have you heard of any initiatives from the Biden administration to grow employee ownership, across the United States? And maybe as well, you know, is there any really interesting initiatives which you're hearing, perhaps in other states beyond California, which are doing really fantastic things in this area?
Yeah. So the Biden administration, yes. So federally, there's a bill called the Main Street Employee Act. And I should know more about what it actually does. But I do know that other folks in the Work Coalition who understand more about it are excited about it, and they personally worked on it to get it passed. And I guess what I do know, because I met one of these people, is that in the Department of Labor, so again, federal, not state, there are now folks in the ERISA office, like Employee Benefits Office, who are tasked through the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, who are tasked with advantaging worker-owned entities. So a couple of these folks who, I don't know if this is a uniquely United States thing, but ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, have all sorts of advantages and history that kind of separate from worker-owned cooperatives. And ESOPs in our federal landscape, like tax landscape and just statutory landscape, are not new and have been able to scale. I mean, there are enormous ESOPs, but they're not all democratic, and there have been problems with them. But then there's also been some great success stories. But at least here, unions are generally a bit skeptical of ESOPs because of how they can be used to offload debt onto workers if they're overvalued. But regardless, the Main Street Employee Ownership Act seems to take the existing ESOP and employee benefits experts inside of the federal DOL and adds to them, hey, you need to also be advising around and understanding worker-owned cooperatives and other democratically run business firms. So there are people there. They've been running. A set of us have met them several times, and they're really trying to learn as much as they can. They're talking to policy experts around worker ownership, and I guess the piece that I'm missing that other people probably do know that I don't is like, what are they going to do with that? That I'm not sure, but at least a first step is including it in their repertoire.
Fantastic. So I've got a question here from Martin, which asks if you could just say a bit more about how unions have been able to incubate cooperatives, and then also if you have any interesting examples which members can look up after this meeting.
Oh yeah, certainly. Well, examples, because I looked to them in order to do this myself. There's Cooperative Home Care Associates in the Bronx in New York. Is a old, I think they were established in the early 80s. Home care cooperative incubated by SEIU 1199, which is the East Coast equivalent to my local. So that's the like longest running one that I know of, and I think they have about 3,000 home care workers. And like I mentioned, the care sectors kind of overrepresent this sort of work here for a number of reasons. So the other ones that immediately come to mind is SEIU in Washington State, 775 is the local. They incubated a home care. It's actually a purpose trust, like a perpetual charitable purpose trust. But it's somewhat similar to the co-op model, called the Trust for Workers, and they created this really clever legislation to get to bid on the contract for the state's workers. So there's 45,000 workers in that now, which is enormous. There's a childcare one developed by local HCII in Illinois. It's like in the Midwest in the US. And they were incubated by the childcare union. to create a childcare cooperative. And then, of course, I most intimately know my own, which is that my local incubated two unionized worker cooperatives of healthcare workers, like basically staffing agencies that are owned by the workers. And there is, I mean, here there's a kind of gray area and then a legally risky area for unions actually creating employers or being too kind of embedded or dominating an employer. So the way that we and others have done this is basically to do not creating the employer itself, but do all the research and kind of front end work to get started. So meeting with workers who want to do this and talking about what they want their guiding principles to be, how they want to actually own it, how they want to do voting, and helping them design it, and even having some outside consultants who specialize in cooperative development come talk with them. But then once it's, filing with the Secretary of State and creating an actual business entity, union staff like myself have to step back, and we can be, we can be partners and advisors. But a key piece of that is that here, at least once the employer is created, it's their choice if they want to unionize or not. So we also had to be quite careful about, they did choose to. And then once you have a formal collective bargaining relationship, there's actually much more opportunity for working in partnership through like a labor management trust. There are already vehicles to allow for, strategic even fundraising and policy work together. But until they unionize, then there's sort of a careful period of like, okay, do what you set you off and do your thing. And then if you want to unionize, like, then we can be, coalition partners again.
That's great. Really interesting model, and I think quite a few learnings for us to take away from that in terms of incubation. There's a couple of other questions which have come in, one from Jean-Roger and one from Chris as well. So Jean-Roger asks, have you seen a kind of uptick in the percentage of cooperatives being developed in California as a result of the act? Has there been an increase in activity in the kind of worker cooperative sector and employee-owned sector more broadly? And then Chris asks specifically about the AFL-CIO, if they've been engaged in cooperatives and if they're seeking to grow the sector as well, if you know their stance on that.
Sure. Well, I don't know about the AFL, so I guess I can say that first. The unions who have reached out or that we are kind of networked with now because we're trying to do similar things, they've not come across to me, so I just don't really know. But lots of other locals or other unions in all kinds of industries, HERE, UFCW, Food and Commercial, Teamsters, ILWU, Longshoremen, Steelworkers. Those are and different SEIU locals. Those are the primary ones that have been really like pushing lately in terms of growing worker cooperatives and union co-ops. And as to your first question, because of the timing, the new bill can't take credit for anything yet. I think, there's nothing operational yet that's helping do. I think it's going to be like another year before it makes movement inside of the GoBiz department and actually starts like connecting people to resources that then result in something where we could say, oh, there's an increase because of this. So that's too early. Although I'll say organically, for all sorts of other reasons, including, I think the pressure cooker created by the pandemic of like economic factors that were already happening that got even worse in the first year of the pandemic. Since that, there has been a lot more activity and growth in both co-ops in California and also in unions helping with co-op stuff. So I don't know if this would have made any news outside of even California, but here this feels like a very big deal. There's a very big brewery called Anchor Brewing. This is just as an example of what I think is happening kind of organically. So Anchor Brewing, so maybe folks have heard, but they were bought by Sapporo, a big international company, and kind of driven into the ground. Although they're a very viable, thriving business with really passionate workers and a long kind of beautiful history in San Francisco. But this big company came in and just kind of changed how things were done. And then now they're, oh, we're going to go bankrupt. We're going to sell off Anchor Steam for $90 million. So like an unheard of scale for workers taking over. And they've already been organized by ILWU in San Francisco. And immediately the workers started meeting with their union and with co-op experts to try to figure out if they could create a worker-owned entity that was unionized, that could bid on Anchor Steam in the bankruptcy process. And they're doing that right now, which, it's bankruptcy. So who knows? And there's other bidders. So who knows how it will end up? But even the fact that they have gotten this far is incredible. They're doing like a crowdfunding raise to raise money to put a bid. There are actually like funders coming through to lend the amount of, I think the bankruptcy sale is more around half, so like 45 million, which again is like multitudes larger than most co-op capital raises. So that's kind of a dramatic example, but there's lots of other kind of more regular scale examples just in the last few years in California and in some other states too, of the first, I think it was in Virginia, but the first veterinary practice to become worker owned just happened in the United States. Like it's just I know some people who love calling these things signals, like and there's a lot of signals that there's more activity in this area owing to like financial pressure, sometimes desperation, and also just people being fed up with the terms of the economy.
And thank you for that, Ray. I had another question which I wanted to ask you as well. I believe you've got a background in platform cooperatives. And so I think, we have an interest in how to grow cooperatives in the technology sector in the UK. And it would be great to hear where the platform cooperative sector really is up to in California and how you're seeking to grow it across the state.
Yeah, that's such an interesting area. There are people who are totally focused on this. Like this folks in the New School, a guy named Trevor Schultz, who there's a set of them who do this like platform cooperative consortium, which I'm part of. It gathers academics, but also people in unions and people trying to kind of scale worker-owned technology alternatives to, let's say, Uber and Lyft and that world of platforms that are extractive instead of actually building capital for the workers themselves. So there's super thoughtful people working on more of like the how to do that stuff. My exposure in a much smaller way to that was around like building the first of the 2 staffing healthcare cooperatives. I guess it depends on your definition, but I think that it was a platform co-op because it was basically a workforce matching tool that was like you could either do it on a tablet or on your computer or on your phone, where licensed vocational nurses would look for shifts and get matched through the co-op to the needs of patients through the clinic system. where they had a contract. So I mean, that's a platform co-op. It was small, but I mean, my personal experience helping do that was that the technology piece of it, we were all aligned around like the workers should own it, and the intellectual property, for example, should live inside the co-op, so that any gains from the technology itself stay with the workers, instead of this, you know, what the platform co-ops rely on, which is basically saying we're a platform, we keep all the capital, but we're not an employer. So this instead made people actual employees, not contractors. The part that was really difficult was how expensive it is to create that technology. So some of the people I know who are working on this, I think it's called CoLab in Los Angeles, and then there's one in Boston. Basically, like very smart coders and data folks who are trying to build stuff that's more like where you can white label for a lot more, like at a lot less of a financial hurdle. Workforce matching, or whatever the common things that platforms do are, like geolocating workers to locations and things like that. So I mean, there's all sorts of like embedded surveillance and data and privacy issues in that, but overall, the idea of platforms that are owned by workers, or user trusts or data trusts that are owned by workers, seems like a pretty incredible piece of this kind of like movement towards, scaling work that, I guess people are kind of becoming used to wanting like flexible work, but not at the expense of having labor protections and having like a good living wage.
Yeah, I think from what we're hearing today, we still have a long way to go here in the UK and in the US, but there seems to be green shoots, and thank you, Ray, for all the work you're doing out in California, helping to grow the worker cooperative and employee-owned sectors. And we wish you all the best as a cooperative party. So thank you for that. And thank you everyone else for taking part today. I think it's been a really interesting and informative session. We've learned a lot, I think, from an international example, and hopefully we'll be able to take those learnings going forward. So thank you again, Ray, for taking your time out of your day to speak to us all. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great evening, and wish you all the very best. And I'm sure see you soon. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.